Antes de empezar con el primer video, quiero decirles de dónde los estoy tomando. La fuente es Iowa PBS. Para los que no saben, PBS es como el servicio público en Estados Unidos, Public Broadcasting Service, que supuestamente es neutral. Pero si ponemos en perspectiva que hay dinero del gobierno de Estados Unidos para financiar una cadena así, obviamente hay agenda de por medio. Así es que de todo lo que se cuenta en esos videos, obviamente nuestra interpretación siempre es más importante, ¿verdad? Nuestro filtro personal. Pero tienen un playlist de cortos, de unos más o menos 9 videos. Pero muchos de ustedes saben que acá en el canal hacemos doblajes. Y sin embargo, este sitio, cuando ustedes van a los subtítulos, ven que tienen un inglés y un inglés autogenerado. Eso quiere decir que alguien se sentó a hacer los subtítulos exactamente bien escritos. Entonces, cuando le aplicamos el auto translate, que solo se puede hacer desde una computadora u ordenador, quisimos hacerles a ustedes los subtítulos mostrados con el corto. Y los que tienen ordenador o computadora podrán hacer esta opción. Si gustan, voy a dejar el link del playlist. Pero los que tienen iPhone o Android o la aplicación móvil, digamos, no está la opción esta de hacer el auto translate. Como pueden ver acá, yo busco y está acá el auto translate y puedo cambiarlo, obviamente, en este caso a español. Y los subtítulos quizá no son 100% exactos, pero casi exactos.
A man named Charles Loring Brace had moved to New York from Connecticut about this time and was appalled by what he saw. Having studied theology, he was unsure that a church ministry would be his calling. Instead, he chose to work with the poor at a New York City mission.
He had seen the poverty of New York firsthand and wanted to do something about it.
Brace observed,
"The truth seems to be that each infant needs one nurse or caretaker, and that if you place these delicate creatures in large companies together in any public building, an immense proportion are sure to die."
When Reverend Charles Loring Brace noticed all of the overcrowded tenements and kids on the street, he knew that something had to happen.
Brace founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853. The society facilitated the placing out of children from existing orphanages. Later, in his 1872 book, Brace explained,
"Most touching of all was the crowd of wandering little ones who immediately found their way to the office. Ragged young girls who had nowhere to lay their heads. Children driven from drunkards' homes. Orphans who slept where they could find a box or stairway. Boys cast out by stepmothers or stepfathers. Newsboys whose incessant answer to our question, 'Where do you live?' rang in our ears, 'Don't live nowhere.' Little bootblacks, young peddlers, canal boys who seemed to drift into the city every winter and live a vagabond life. Pickpockets and petty thieves trying to get honest work. Child beggars and flower sellers growing up to intercourses of crime. All this motley throng of infantile misery and childish guilt passed through our doors, telling their simple stories of suffering and loneliness and temptation until our hearts became sick."
During this time period, homeless people were considered criminals, that if you were homeless, you deserved it. And he really had the forward thinking to realize that these children were born into it. They didn't really have a choice.
Brace began wondering whether farmers in the Midwest and elsewhere, many eager for a helping hand, might welcome these children.
They needed help establishing their claims and homesteads. And so he set up, it was kind of an indenture program where the children were expected to work for their room and board, work on the farm, help establish their claim. But then the parents in turn were supposed to educate them, send them to Sunday school, send them to church, give them a good Christian upbringing as well.
Brace wrote in his book,
"We hope especially to be the means of draining the city of these children by communicating with farmers, manufacturers, or families in the country who may have need of such for employment."
In September 1854, Brace's dream of sending children to new homes in the rural West became a reality when the first orphan train was sent to Dowagiac, Michigan. The society sent 47 boys and girls, ages 7 to 15. The test was deemed a success, and more trains carried children away from New York in the subsequent years. Within 10 years of the first orphan train being sent to the Midwest, the nation was embroiled in the Civil War. The war created thousands of orphans and half-orphans who were ultimately placed on the orphan trains. A group of Roman Catholic nuns started the New York Foundling Hospital, a medical and care center for abandoned infants. The sisters chose to follow the example of the Children's Aid Society in seeking new homes for the babies.
What the Sisters of Charity did in 1869, many years later than the orphan train's beginning with the Children's Aid Society, was they set a basket out, a cradle, if you will, and any mother could leave a child she could no longer care for with no questions asked.
And they started sending children out on their own version of the orphan trains. Those were called the mercy trains or baby trains because they focused on younger children, and you essentially ordered a child from the New York Foundling Hospital. The New York Foundling Hospital had a little bit more of a family-oriented selection process where they would the families would write into the orphanage and say, I want a blue-eyed, blonde-haired boy. And they would get a blue-eyed, blonde-haired boy. Yeah, it was like ordering a child out of a catalog.
In my mother's case, what they did is they applied for a girl around the age of 2 with brown hair and brown eyes. And that is the way the foundlings' children were handled.
Identification tags were sewn into the foundling children's clothing to ensure they reached the proper family when arriving at a busy train station. They later shifted to placing numbers on the children. The Children's Aid Society typically tried to name a local committee to screen applicants for suitability prior to a train's arrival in their town. The foundling home instead asked a local priest to help find ideal parents for a child.
They all have a great legacy that they have passed on to American culture and life. Life in New York City, especially in the late 1800s, was chaotic. This was a time of great influx of immigrants coming into New York, which happened to be one of our largest ports. And New York actually did not know what to do with the overflow of population. And many of the immigrants coming into New York City found hardships equal to the ones that they thought they left behind. Their suffering actually extended on to their children.
In 1849, New York City's chief of police decided to sound an alarm about what he described as the constantly increasing number of vagrant, idle, and vicious children of both sexes who infest our public thoroughfares, hotels, and docks. A New York State Commission filed this report in response. The great mass of poorhouses are most disgraceful memorials of the public charity. Common domestic animals are usually more humanely provided for than the paupers in some of these institutions. By the 1870s, the orphan trains of the Children's Aid Society were rolling into towns in more than 30 states. An average of more than 3,000 children a year were rocked by the iron cradle on journeys away from orphanages. The story of the orphan train movement is not simply about orphanages and policies, but rather the story of the thousands of children who made those journeys to places unknown and forever changed the landscape of rural America. Most of their stories had been forgotten in the attic of American history. However, children, grandchildren, and other relatives of some of these orphan train riders have begun digging up their stories.
We estimate there's over 2 million direct descendants nationwide of an orphan train rider. It's really a story of survival and how these children kind of beat the odds of what they were dealt with being born in New York City during this time period.
La publicación se llama The Morning Star and Catholic Messenger. Es básicamente la estrella de la mañana y el mensajero católico del marzo 1 de 1874. Esto es un año después de haber tenido una crisis económica pareciera que andan como buscando dinero de aquí para allá, entonces echemos culpa a los que nos caen mal. Y así quedó pues este reporte. Acá está el de inglés, hicimos una versión en español también como para ser más fácil, aquí se las presentamos en un momento. Ok, el artículo, por lo menos la parte que nos habla el señor Charles, dice: el New York Herald ha causado una sensación genuina en los últimos días por sus selecciones de los informes publicados de las diversas instituciones benéficas en y sobre Nueva York. Algunos de ellos son viejos conocidos de nuestros lectores. La Children's Aid Society, por ejemplo, que durante muchos años ha dedicado sus energías, y el excedente de efectivo, o sea, muy lucrativo al parecer, que pudo ahorrar de sus inversiones en ferrocarriles y los salarios de sus oficiales, a sacar niños católicos a Occidente y consignándolos a veces a los mejores postores y a veces a la caridad pública. Entonces como que ya dejan de ver su intención. Hay dinero sobrante donde se le ha sacado quizá una gran ganancia. Hay inversión en los ferrocarriles. Así es que seguimos. Dice por acá que esta sociedad, cuyo director, el señor Charles Loring Brace, es un estimado corresponsal de 1 o 2 semanarios religiosos. O sea, el señor tiene mucha representación en este tipo de publicaciones. El Herald muestra que ha estado extrayendo $70,000 anuales de la ciudad para el mantenimiento de 9,000 niños, mientras que solo tiene 3,000 menores a su cuidado. Una práctica muy común incluso actualmente, donde una persona le dice al Estado que tiene mucho trabajo y por eso pide mucho dinero, pero realmente tiene poco, y obviamente la diferencia de ese dinero, quién sabe a dónde se usó, ¿verdad? Puede ser en el mercado de las líneas ferroviarias. Tiene casi 170,000 invertidos en acciones ferroviarias, paga altos salarios a sus empleados y, si no nos equivocamos seriamente, se ha esforzado con éxito por evadir ciertas disposiciones de las leyes promulgadas por sus amigos con el propósito de restringir las organizaciones benéficas sectarias. Esto es una publicación católica sacando los trapos sucios del señor Charles Loring Brace, pero me hace pensar que ellos probablemente también lo tienen, pero quien ataca primero se ve incluso mejor ante la opinión pública. Pero para el 79 milagrosamente los redujeron. En 1881 el señor Charles hace un discurso famoso en Harvard de todo lo que él hizo durante estos años atrás, de lo exitoso que ha sido y la necesidad de los niños, pero como vimos hay muchas inconsistencias y obviamente los niños son los que pagaron ese precio porque fueron usados. Se dice que fue para ayudar al país, buscarles trabajo, darles algo para que hicieran, que salieran de las cárceles, pero suena como que el daño ya estaba. Creamos un problema, ofrezcamos la solución, no lo solucionamos completamente, hay otro problema. Nos vemos mal en la opinión pública, arreglémoslo de casualidad, salgamos en la opinión pública a dar un gran discurso y en 1890 el señor muere. Pero por ahora sería todo. Si tienen algún comentario que le agregue a esta gran conversación, se los agradecería un montón y nos vemos en la próxima. Si te gustó el contenido del canal, no olvides suscribirte, darle campanita para notificaciones, darle me gusta, comentar o compartir. Hasta la próxima.